Robert, I'm very pleased to have you here. And I was very excited when you asked me if you could have an interview with me, because I read your book and it so much reflects what actually is going on astrologically right now. So I know that you said you don't know much about astrology, and that's exciting because you can see it unfolding already, even with people who do not know a lot of astrology. So the quality of time is a specific one nowadays, and your book very much reflects that. So I'm happy to have you here and to have this discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I've said this before in some of these things. For a Rosicrucian and someone interested in Hermeticism, I am kind of woefully astrologically illiterate. I've been picking some things up more recently, having gone through, with the help of other people, a kind of series of planetary conjurations that was over the course of 18 months. That was quite meaningful, and that certainly helped get me up to speed. But I'm certainly not astrologically adept in any way, shape, or form. And but the reason I really wanted to kind of reach out to you is because I'd really liked your blog posts that were accessible, with, you could tell, a lot of astrological depth and expertise behind them. My background's more in kind of anthropology, mythology, symbolism, so I kind of saw you doing a lot of that work and found that really interesting. So I thought, yeah, why not? Let's keep these interesting conversations going. And in the circles, in the kind of Rosicrucian circles I'm in, there are a lot of people who are interested about the astrological shifts that are occurring, both that occurred a few years ago, and everyone's kind of seen the results of much of that, really, but then are about to occur or are occurring now as well. So they're starting to talk about very similar things. So I'm always, ears are open to hear that kind of stuff, even though it's not really something I know too much about, I have to admit.
Yeah, and I know that many people who follow my channel, they are interested in the astrology, and astrology only helps you if you understand what you are doing with that kind of information. So that's what we are talking today. We are talking actually about the future and the future changes that are reflected through astrology, and what we can do with that kind of knowledge. And what is the big thing that happens right now is that we are asked to focus on the air element. So the air is about the mind, the intellect, about our thoughts, values, and so on. So as you said, a few years ago, we already experienced a major shift. Everybody could feel it. So we had the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in 2020 that ushered us into an elemental air era that lasts for 200 years. So it's a big change. So it will affect the future in long term. But then we had the Libra Venus star point coming onto the Venus star, the 5-pointed Venus star, in October this year. So this is also a major shift. And Libra is an air sign. So we have a lot of air going on right now. So we have Pluto also transitioning into Aquarius. So your book is, you wrote a book, and that's why we are here. We're talking about the book, and the book is called 21st Century Rosicrucianism. And you write very much about that kind of attitude we have to have when we are going into the future, and that's what is actually related to the mind. What do we think about the future? What do we think about values and ethics? And a lot of things have been changing with AI and with transhumanism, and you are very much focused on those things. So although people might know Rosicrucian is an old tradition, so it's not something new. It's not something that has been invented in the 21st century. But what are we doing with that old tradition? What is the core of the tradition, and what can it bring to us into the future and into our present day? So what are the core ideas of Rosicrucianism?
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, this is the book, 21st Century Rosicrucianism. Sorry, my video may not be flipped there, but 21st Century Rosicrucianism, and it kind of comes out of being part of this tradition in its modern form, some of its modern forms, for the last 20 years or more, and really grappling with what these old European esoteric traditions were teaching us and not just in the sense of personal spiritual development and practices we can do that enter into those kind of meditative spaces or contemplative spaces, but also how these things and what you find there through those devotional practices can then relate to how we experience our lives in the modern world. Things like the internet, smartphones, modern technology, and medicine. I mean, these were the kinds of pinnacles of occult dreaming in the 17th century, these kind of abilities to talk to one another across space and geographical distance, or to have medical advancements that enable our longevity and our healing and disease prevention to be extended to unfathomable degrees to the kind of people who are forming these traditions. So there's a lot of kind of ways we've grown into what they were talking about, but then there's a lot of ways that we've also lost sight of what they were talking about. We've lost sight of that spiritual element. We're losing sight of the devotional element of our lives and the ability to really connect with not just science, which was important to the Rosicrucian tradition in many forms. It was part of that kind of lead up to the Enlightenment, but to nature as well, and nature in both a organic forest environmental sense, but also in a cosmic universe macrocosm type sense. And so I wanted to kind of, over the course of 20 years, I've been trying to reconcile a lot of these things. I've been presenting papers both to Rosicrucian circles and study groups of various kinds, but also in my professional career, I worked for the Church of England for almost a decade and worked for at St. Paul's Cathedral for a department there called St. Paul's Institute that was focusing a lot on financial ethics, social justice, inclusive capitalism, if you want to call it that, although is there such a thing, we are to find out. But at the same time as doing all of these kind of Rosicrucian explorations, I was professionally trying to connect with a lot of better ways for society to structure itself. And so the book has both the Rosicrucian esoteric essays I was writing and some of the very public thought pieces that were kind of coming out in a much more public, professional, exoteric sense, and then couples it with a sense of what I feel it means to be a practicing Rosicrucian today, and some of the different kind of elements that we need to incorporate in order to have a fulfilling spiritual life. So the book is an amalgamation of all of these different things, and by integrating them all, it's kind of, for my own personal journey, brought a lot of threads together that I can then kind of move forward with in a much more integrated way. But it seems to be also speaking into a lot of people in these circles really want to talk about how do these things have an impact on the world around us, not just our own personal development. So I'm excited to see all the different conversations that have been emerging off the back of it, and really have helped influence it over the course of many years. So.
I love that in your book, exactly the union of the spirit and the physical world, your own practice, but then going out, being there, being seen, taking part in shaping society. Not only the idea, as you said, going within, meditating, studying, but then taking that knowledge and bringing it into the broader perspective, into the circles you naturally live within, your family, your neighborhood. So that is it's very practical. It's not only an esoteric tradition. It's not only thinking about the depth of spirituality, but taking that knowledge that you gain from there and bringing it outside. And what is special in your book is that you actually have defined 3 stages in that cycle. And I love that it's a cycle. It's not only we are here and then we are going there, but it's a cycle of, I will read it. You had 3 stages, and the first is personal practice, then the second is social engagement, and the third is spiritual retreat. And it recurs within your life. So it's not that you first do this, then that, and then you're ready, and then you're ready to go. to heaven or somewhere else. It's a cycle, and I love that very much. And it's also very unique for each individual. The phase is, how long is it? How much can I expand? How much time can I use with social engagement? What does it mean for me? So I love this, the cycle of giving and receiving. And that is also what, as an astrologer, I always think about the quality of time. And with the Venus star, the Libra coming in, it's about giving and receiving. The star, you give and you receive. And it's that constant interaction with the world. And it seems to me that Rosicrucianism has a very deep love for the earth and for humanity. It's not only imagining something better to come in the afterlife beyond our physical reality. It's not only imagining in heaven a paradise somewhere else. It's taking part in co-creating the presence and the future here on earth. I love that.
Absolutely. That is really central to the Rosicrucian tradition. So there's kind of two things that I think are really key here. One is from the original manifestos, early 17th century, is this key term, cure the sick, and that gratis. It says, the Fama Fraternitatis says this is our primary reason for being, essentially, is to do this. Now, healing, therefore, is a really important part of the Rosicrucian tradition, and healing as a service, not as a charitable service, as a gift, gratis. Healing others without expectation of financial or status gain in return. So that, almost from the very, very beginning, to be honest, I think in the 17th century it did have quite a literal meaning about physic medicine, about actual physically healing, and at that time there was a lot of kind of charlatans and fake medical healers, and there was a lot of people who were being very extortionate with the way they would use these practices. So they were rallying against that a little bit. But I think it very quickly, even from the 17th century, became much more of an understanding of, well, how do we heal the kind of illnesses of the human condition? And this is even within the original kind of manifestos and other things. How do we heal those kind of sicknesses? And that is a real part of the Rosicrucian tradition. It's a big part of the esoteric traditions in general, I think, is how do we overcome the more kind of destructive, corrupting aspects of our material primal beings. And then the other aspects that really feeds into this, which you've kind of alluded to, is that there's been a very, very strong thread of utopianism in Rosicrucianism. And this goes back to Johann Andre, who was one of the people who we believe pretty convincingly that he was part of the original circle of people. He at least kind of authored the Chemical Wedding Manifesto and potentially was involved in the other two. And he wrote a book called Christianopolis, a utopian text in a very kind of literary utopian genre format. Francis Bacon is often connected at least to the Rosicrucian stream, if not as a specific individual himself, wrote the book New Atlantis. There's some that kind of predate the manifestos, such as Campanella's City of the Sun. And then there's people such as Comenius with the Labyrinth and the Paradise of the World and things like that. And can't remember the title of that, but yes, the Labyrinth and the Paradise, Comenius's text. So these kind of utopian texts are very central to the Rosicrucian tradition. And they're both alluding to personal, internal developments. A lot of these utopian texts are allegorical, certainly, but they're trying to envisage social structures that can live up to these forms of spiritual development at the same time. So spiritual development is not something that just happens on an individual level. It is something that should necessarily happen on a social level as well. And so I really like that aspect of the Rosicrucian tradition. I felt it was a really under-recognized aspect of it. There's been some people who have kind of been focusing on it more in recent years, but and it is mentioned, obviously, but it's not something that I think people have really sunk their teeth into when they think Rosicrucianism. And so utopianism to me also means this kind of hopeful vision of the future, this hopeful vision of where we can get to if we put into practice all of these things that emerge from that very kind of just and beneficial part of our being. And so I think the modern world is filled with a lot of dystopian images of what the future can be, a lot of catastrophic images, a lot of unjust images of where the future could be. And I think it's really important for us to not lose sight of the fact that there's still hope, and there's always hope, and that we can start to envisage very positive futures as well. And going back to kind of what you were talking about the astrological significance of entering into an era of the mind, it's really also means that era of the imaginative space, of the thought forms that emerge from our consciousness that become our material reality. And this has always been important to the European esoteric tradition. I can't talk about others just because I'm not well versed in them, but I'm sure it's important around the world, that it's about that imaginative space in our consciousness, because that is where the creative source of everything that we can create and everything that we can make exist comes from. And so getting in touch with that imaginative space in a way which is devotional and which is deeply spiritual and esoteric and becomes visionary is, I think, what is a lot of these things are actually about. And so it seems like now is the time that we really desperately need to be kind of reaching those states of being, not as individuals, but as a kind of shared effort, and then supporting one another along the way. And I see more and more of that happening, which is very hopeful. So
it's a time where it is important to get awareness of what our mind can do, what we can do with imagination, with thinking about the future consciously, not just being afraid and being in this kind of receiving state. Let's see what happens. No, but being actively imagining a better future and then taking steps towards achieving that. And as you said, it's the era of the air element, and I think we are being fed new inspiration also. We will get new people feel already the push for change, and people already start to talk more about social justice, about the collective. But as we move forward as a collective, it's upon each individual how we take our place into shaping the future, or in shaping the future. It's not just miraculously happening by itself. So we have to take part in it, and it only can be received through becoming aware of the quality of time, what is happening, and then navigating that new kind of energy that we are given into something good. We have to shape it. So we get the raw energy in a way, and the mind feeds us with ideas and with possibilities, but we have to take it and to shape it to something tangible.
Exactly. And I think there's a couple of points in there. The first is we are at a really important time, and that's because the kind of technological scientific progress has reached a point now where the things we imagine become reality in a more and more rapid kind of process. And not only that, we're now building kind of imaginative layers on top of physical reality. And I'm really sorry if the building site next door and the drills make too much noise. Apologize for that. I can't imagine those away, unfortunately. But we're building this kind of imaginative layer over the top of physical reality with our digital realms. And we're now entering those digital realms in a much more kind of integrated way with our lives. Tell me if that is way too distracting, by the way.
No, it's okay. I can hear you good.
And so that there's really important things happening. One is that this kind of scientific and technological progress is advancing. So the people who are involved in bringing those things to fruition are the kind of people, whether consciously or not, are helping dictate the direction that humanity itself will take, the very forms we will take, the very biological forms we will take, the emotional forms we will take. All of these things are now being altered and manipulated and tinkered with in ways that at the moment are kind of being exploited in many ways. There's that kind of commercial, profit-driven, power-driven drive that we've seen through a lot of the kind of digital spaces that we have at the moment, that is becoming a bit worrying with how all-encompassing they are, and how they kind of steer people down pretty unproductive, if not quite violent and corrupting paths. So there's that period where we're entering into, that it's now more important than ever for us to actually participate in it. As you say, actually take some stand in helping create or carve out spaces that are using these things very positively. And then there's also just now this kind of accessibility of it all as well, and the ability for us to access all of these things. You know, it's not just that we're in a moment of all this transition, but we're also in a moment where we're given access to the tools to participate in it. And so that, to me, is a big part of what this means. And, you know, we have more access to the spiritual traditions than ever before, at least in informative terms, and in the ability to connect with one another around the world. And then when we put those things into practice, what emerges from them, we now have the tools more than ever to help integrate what emerges with the wider world. And so there's an opportunity here. I think that's what it boils down to. We have an opportunity here. We have the kind of tools and resources needed. We have to put in the work, with a capital W, of course. But when we do so, we also have somewhere for that to go. And I think it's a space that desperately needs more of that at the moment. So I'm really just encouraging people, as you said as well, in a very non-prescriptive way. The book doesn't have many, other than sometimes, ironically enough, turning off your smartphone occasionally, turning off the internet occasionally, because as much as these things are important to participate in, we also have to kind of find who we are outside of them. But it's non-prescriptive because it means different things to different people. And there's no one-size-fits-all approach. But the one-size-fits-all approach is about participation, co-creation. It is about entering into these spiritual spaces in order to then give and communicate and connect with others through what you receive.
Yeah, and when you go back to the essence of Rosicrucianism, which is a Christian tradition, there's a lot that is similar today, but a lot has changed. So back in the day, it was a Christian tradition, and it was more about getting the tools to heal the sick. So it was about science, it was about medicine. But nowadays it has broadened. It's not it's not one only path for everybody. It's much wider, it's broader. And then it's not so much about finding the tools to heal the sick, like literally sick people. Nowadays it's the question, how far can we go? We have all the tools, we have possibilities, opportunities. Now it's more about ethics. Okay, what is necessary? Is it healing the sick? Is it something that is needed to provide a good life for all people, or is it something that goes overboard with it? So as you said, the profit angle, you know, people profiting from creating needs that we actually don't have, or the ethical side about how much can you extend your life, how much can you better the quality of your life? Do you need to implant something into your brain, for example? You know, it's a tricky question with the transhumanism. What is needed? Where is the boundary to going into something that cannot be unmade? And what is our responsibility in all that? You said very well that we all have access nowadays, much more to co-creating than the people had back in the day. So it's upon each of us to think about our ethics, our morals. How do we interact with people, for example? Even on the internet, just if you comment, or if you get a comment on a post, what are you doing with that comment? Are you reacting or not? I have oftentimes seen that people do not even react to any of the comments they post, and they don't interact with the people. So what is your ethics in that? Why do you post something if you don't want to engage? So these are little things, and still they are very much related to the connection between ourselves and the divine, actually, because we all are connected and everything affects us. So the more people are getting involved into social media, connecting one another, the more it affects the collective in general and us back. So if this makes sense.
I mean, there's so many layers here to unpack. That's why it's such a fascinating kind of discussion. It goes both ways as well, doesn't it? It's like sometimes there's people who spend too much time responding to things on social media, or it's like, and you see this a lot even in the spiritual side of things. There's people who are over commoditizing their own spiritual path and practice. And that's not to say that people can't, receive any kind of a living for offering people what are quite important services or workshops or whatever. I'm not disparaging that, but I think we can all recognize there's sometimes this over commercialization and over commoditization of the spiritual that takes place, and social media has only exacerbated that in many ways as people become their own brands and they become they've got this mission to earn X amount of money, and so they start to see people in very transactional terms as opposed to as fully realized spiritual beings on their own journey of their own right. So there's a real danger in all of this, but that doesn't mean we should just completely retract from it, because it is where the energy and the future of humanity is going. So it's a really tricky thing, but we have to be very open about the kind of challenges of it, I think, and we have to not shy away from being open about how it can be both spiritually useful and beneficial, and also quite dangerous in its own way. So yes, and there's so many layers to all of this. It's again, it's like, how do we? One of the things I'm interested in, which isn't really much in the book, but as we exist more and more digitally, how do we keep connected with nature, and how does that digital nature relationship continue to exist in a way that's harmonious, and is a way, there's so much to be gained from our digital realms in the forms of knowledge and in the forms of information sharing and social networks and connectivity. But then, how much can we gain that benefits our mental health and well-being, our understanding of the world, our kind of sense of cosmic humbleness or appreciation that we can get from just, going off and walking in the woods for a couple of hours. And so these things contain a lot of information of their own right that we have perhaps lost connection with, or many of us, depending on your age. I'm one of those people who straddled both the post and pre-digital age, but I think many people are much more familiar with the digital world than they are with the natural world these days. And what does that mean? I don't come with many answers, I'm afraid, but I'd just like to posit a lot of important questions, I feel. Because what does that mean? It is part of the natural evolution of humanity within the cosmos. These things don't exist outside of the macrocosmic universe. They're part of it. They are part of all of this. But as I think you said near the beginning, we have to go into it a bit more consciously, because they can become prisons or illusions of their own right, as opposed to being used in a way to kind of uplift what we have the potential to be. So
I love that you mentioned nature.
Yeah, and I mean, that's something, again, I've as someone who recently moved from a large metropolis into a more rural area, it's something only in the last 2 or 3 years I've really come to appreciate properly, which is perhaps why I have I saw the contrast of it.
And it's oftentimes that we need the contrast to understand what we are actually missing. You cannot understand what you're missing before you actually got rid of it for a long time. Then you understand, okay, yeah, now something is missing. And actually, nature is our first connection. So that's something that I think is the goal or the task of planet Earth. This physical realm, it's built in a certain way for a certain reason. So, so in some traditions, the focus is on in a way, I would almost say escaping the physical reality and trying to focus only on the mind and the spirit. And I think this can be dangerous because, as I said, there's a reason why planet Earth is 3D, whereas why it is physical, why we have a physical body. And I don't think it is anything evil. So I think the physical reality is a good one, and we need to cherish that connection. But also it is true that back in the day, it might have been necessary for people to understand there is a difference between spirit and body, or there is something that is spirit, and that is the physical reality, which is embedded in time. And then there's something that is outside of time, which is the spirit. But both go together. Both are a union here on planet Earth. And that's what we need to understand, that we need both. We need to cherish the physical reality, but we need also to concentrate on the spirit. And only if you understand both and if you love both, you can actually master your life here on planet Earth. And I think this is important for spiritual growth. And maybe it is the time now that people understand that union more, not thinking that the physical realm would be evil and we need to get rid of everything physical, of the senses or anything, but also understanding that the spirit and the eternal soul is important, and we need to keep growing towards our potential that we have. And actually the physical realm is given as a tool to us, so we can understand the spirit through the physical world, through the earth, through nature. There's great wisdom in nature. So I love that very much, that your book on several pages you write about that connection between the spirit and the earth, between having a connection to the divine, a personal connection, a deep spiritual connection, but then coming to the physical realm back and cherishing nature and doing something that can help other people transform their lives. So I love that. Your book is great. And I have so many notes in your book that I found so beautiful. You have a good way in explaining what you actually mean. So I encourage people to read your book.
Oh, thank you. I've just tried to be very open in the book, no pretense. This is where I'm at. There's explorations in there. There's essays in there that, I wrote 10 years previously that now I wouldn't necessarily agree with every sentence in there, but I left them in there because it's also part of the journey of discovery that we go through. So the book itself has tried to be very honest and open. And I think that is resonating with people because, I think if we put up these facades of perfection, and there's nothing worse than a facade of spiritual perfection, right? Because we know that, 99.99999% of the time, people are not going to be anywhere near the facade of spiritual perfection that they might be projecting. So the more we can just kind of try to relate to one another about these kinds of things in a very open and honest way, I think it's just very beneficial to everybody and for ourselves as well, to kind of get a bit outside of our own egos sometimes and realize that we're pretty flawed and we don't do these things to the ideals that we might espouse to. But that doesn't mean that you don't keep the ideals and talk about the ideals, because that's kind of striving you to do better and be better. And another thought that came to mind when you were talking then was that there's this kind of Neoplatonic and Hermetic idea of the great chain of being. And every link on that chain is important, even the material realm at the so-called bottom of it, in illustrative terms. Is important. It all exists for a reason, and it all has a relationship to one another and an ability to impact things in different ways. And I think a big part of the esoteric traditions is an understanding that our material forms have a role to play. And if everything could be done by the kind of divine or angelic or even macrocosmic kind of forces, then there would be no need for the microcosmic individual forces to exist at all. But we do, and there's something in that which is about consciousness, and it's about that imaginative space, which is that kind of glimmer of divine potentiality that we have. But we are that kind of conduit through which that then interacts with the macrocosmic and even the microcosmic realms. And so it is about what is the purpose of our materiality, whilst understanding that we can kind of miss the forest for the trees sometimes if we're hyper focused on the materiality. But both things have a purpose. So I really like the fact that you said that it's not just about these kind of monastic, very intensely mystical, escape from the world, enter into these kind of divine experiences. Those things are very, very powerful, and I'm not denying that whatsoever, and they can be incredibly influential. But if they're only done purely for their own sake and purely for the sake of the individual experiencing them, then I kind of slightly shrug my shoulders and say, well, what's the point? It's if all we're here and incarnated to be is to find a way back, struggling to return, then that feels awfully unfair in many ways, because it's a hell of a struggle to return. And that's why I don't really buy into that narrative. It is more about what are we here to achieve. And that speaks a lot, I think, to the kind of the motivation that we put into our spiritual practices, why we're doing them, how are we using what we find through our explorations of these things. And that speaks, not just the Rosicrucian tradition, but many traditions that are focused on service and are focused on love and charity and compassion and all of these things which seem very trite terms, but actually contain kind of all the secrets of the human condition and our explorations within them. Very simple terms sometimes, but the truth has been in front of our faces the whole time, really. But it's entering into those things in a way that you truly not only understand their impact, but kind of start to get a sense of where they're emerging from. I think a lot of the esoteric paths are about getting in touch with those sources through which these things emerge into consciousness. And that's a lifelong, sometimes multi-lifelong, depending on your cosmology, relationship. But that's what it's all about, I think.
Yeah, and it is a universal experience, actually. Everybody coming to planet Earth has to deal with that understanding of the spirit of the material world. We are all in the same boat, actually, and that is why Rosicrucianism, for example, it's quite universal. And I like that you highlight in your book that it's not about the one path, it's not about doctrine, it's not about someone showing you the door and you have to go through that door and that's the only way. It's about giving you the tools to explore your relationship with the divine and find your own way, your own path. So there is, of course, the Christian tradition, and there is the stories, of course, in the Bible. They are very important and what they mean, but it's not in a doctrinal way. It's not someone telling you that this story tells you about that, and that's the only translation or interpretation you can have. It's about exchange, reading the stories, exchanging, learning from one another. And you said in your book that already in the Pharma, it was very much about going out, learning from other people, from other cultures, from other traditions, from other religions, then coming back and having a discussion. So it's not about, as you said, it's not about being in a monastery for the rest of your life. It's about going out there, learning, and then giving back. And I like that very much, that kind of global focus, not only we and our tradition, but what can we learn from other people, and how can we change, how can we better our understanding, and what can we give back to other traditions. So that's one part of the tradition I like very much.
Exactly, yeah. It's been said of Rosicrucianism, and I think it's Anton Favre, the author. I've only heard this secondhand through the talks other people have given. I haven't read his work. But it's said that Rosicrucianism is when German mysticism came into contact with Hermeticism through Paracelsus. So I think that's a lovely definition, but what does that sentence mean? German mysticism at the time was very Protestant, it was very Lutheran. It was this reaction to institutional dogma within the Christian tradition. And it was trying to reconnect people with that sense of the ability to engage with these things from where you're at as an individual, without all of us have that connection to the divine that nobody can gatekeep. So it's that kind of mysticism in that Christian, Protestant, Lutheran perspective historically, connecting with the Hermeticism that was coming up through the Middle East and Egypt and Northern Africa into Italy and Greece, and being translated by the likes of Ficino and others in Northern Italy, and then emerging into Europe. And they were starting to connect with those traditions. That's the kind of astrological, alchemical traditions and understanding of these spiritual and occult and esoteric practices, and also a kind of a cosmology, that Neoplatonic cosmology of our relationship to the gradations of creation that lead all the way back to the one divine source. And then importantly, then through Paracelsus, that's where that healing element comes in. So it's that notion that you're there to serve, you're there to use the natural world as a way, as a path to healing as well. That's why there is a big alchemical focus in Rosicrucianism historically, and always has been important. And that comes from a lot of that. And, Paracelsus brings us these kind of an importance of the concepts of the elements, and importance of the concepts of natural remedies and healing and holistic medicine, and just all of these things, which I think in the modern world have kind of been put at odds with science in many ways. But these were the explorations that also kind of led to the emergence and birth of science. And so I think there is a very kind of rational scientific method behind a lot of their thinking. It just doesn't always have a very reductive, empirical kind of basis for its search for truth. It takes a much broader view of what they're looking for, but still tries to do it methodically. And that's what I really like, because I find, obviously, the pure scientific approach is very reductive and can be quite soulless in its own way, and can be lacking a sense of where that will end up going and being used for, and to quite devastating effect sometimes. Whereas the opposite effect, which is essentially just we'll go where our feelings take us, and if we like something and it makes us feel happy and it makes us, then we'll just go there. That can sometimes have an illusory sense to it. You can kind of get caught up in a little bubble that you've created, a bubble of meaning that you've created, and that can be great or benign or happy for some people, but it can also be used in very manipulative ways. So, belief can be used to manipulate people, just as it can be used to enlighten and liberate people. So as with all these things, there is that kind of balance. You need the methodical, you need the rational, but you also need the imaginative and the emotional and the ecstatic, and you need all these things to kind of operate in balance with one another. And at least for me personally, through the traditions I've come into contact with in my own place in this world, Rosicrucianism seemed to kind of straddle those two things quite well.
Yeah, you mentioned a few important things. First of all, the Rosicrucian tradition was founded during a time that was very reformative. So there were big changes happening during that time. And when I was looking at the cycles, the astrological cycles back then, I realized that the founding literature was actually written during a time when Libra was on the Venus star, on the Venus pentagram. So we are just entering entered a Libra Venus star point period. So there are similarities. So that's very interesting. But there are also, of course, big changes within the great mutation cycle of Jupiter and Saturn. So I won't go into these now, but it's interesting to see that these times where reformation wants to take place, they reoccur. It's a cycle. Life always is cyclical. So we can see that what happened back then had its own meaning, and people tried to do their best within that time frame they were living in, and the knowledge they had and the possibilities they had. And now we are at the same stage or at the same phase where we think about reformation in a way, what needs to change. We can feel the push, and now it's up on us to see what we can do with our knowledge we have nowadays, with the possibilities that are given to us right now. And what actually also is important to understand, that the physical reality is built on polarities. So we can understand things through polarities. Without polarities, you wouldn't be able to distinguish from one another. You wouldn't understand what is eternal, what is bound in time, for example. And it's very important that we have that, but we also need to keep them together. Like you said, it's not beneficial to think only about science and then not having a context where you actually can use it. But it's also not good to be without any conscious or awareness and just living your life and see what happens.
Yes,
in a way. So without consciousness, how do you heal? So you can heal if you have studied how the human body functions, for example, how chemicals react within the body, and so on. So we need both. We need science, but we also need the physical realm where we actually can act with our tools we have. And then what it boils down to is that we need to have a good heart. So that's the motivation, the core motivation why we are here and what we are doing. And we have to think about our motivations. What are our motivations for our actions?
And that's kind of goes back to you mentioned the three kind of phases of the Rosicrucian cycle that I put in the book, and they're trying to balance these things on a very large categorical way. And that's where you have the personal practice is that daily rhythm, which helps you build that goodness within. It's a process, and it's also something that we get wrong on a daily basis. You know, the probably most enlightened of us get it wrong on a monthly or a weekly basis, right? No matter how far along you are, there will be moments where you don't live up to these ideals. But it's those personal practices that are done as regularly as possible that help us kind of steer back and reflect on and mature from and grow and learn and then also seek to undo any of the negative kind of influences we put out into the world. And we all do this in different ways. We all have our flaws. But then we all have, particularly those of us who are interested in these kind of discussions, we all have our own personal practices that help us kind of bring us back into that core path that we want to be traveling on. So personal practice then is really important. Social engagement is then that element which reminds us at all times that we're not just doing this for ourselves. So this is a process of collective healing that is taking place, collective development, that we need to participate in. And so social engagement means a lot of different things. It doesn't just mean volunteering at a local homeless shelter or something. It can mean doing a lot of voluntary or charity work. For a lot of people, that's very impacting and very meaningful. It can mean being involved in a lot of sustainability campaigning or other things. It can mean being involved in, putting on podcasts or writing or anything that helps you connect your own personal journey with others in a way that's uplifting, I think is part of that social engagement category. And then spiritual retreat is something I struggle with the most. And I think from what I've seen with other people, it's something a lot of people struggle with. We can be very good at our personal practices, our daily rituals or prayers or whatever, meditations or whatever it may be. We're pretty good at our social engagement. And then spiritual retreat is something that seems lacking for a lot of people. And it's something that a lot of people are intrigued by. So that is when you're able to strip back everything that you're influenced by on a day-to-day basis so that you're able to have a very raw and honest and devotional experience of your relationship with the divine, in a way that can be very communicative, very visionary, and acts as a kind of source of spiritual nourishment that you then take back to your personal practice and social. And this is where that cycle continues. Spiritual retreat is not something that we can all do all the time. Some people do live monastic lives, and that's great, but it's a very rare occasion, particularly in this day and age. But it is something that we need to get a sense of how we have it in our lives, because I think it's something that's quite lacking at the moment. And it can often be as simple as, a weekend off hiking in the woods without an internet connection or a smartphone, right? And just start stripping back all of those layers of influence and all of those layers of information and stimulus and responsibility even, and just everything that kind of drives us in different directions. And finding a way to strip all of that back and just enter into a very open communicative space. So those three things that's that kind of cycle of process that's trying to both bring us out and back in and out again, that kind of in and out, breathing in and out process that the spiritual path is, that I found quite helpful as a framework, because it is non-prescriptive. It is just about having these certain pillars that you look at, and you then kind of get to figure out what it means where you're at.
Absolutely. It's a flux of the energy flow within your life. And I have often, from an astrological perspective, seen that people, well, actually divine helps us with our cycles, because we all have unique cycles, and we live our life through these cycles. So sometimes you will see that someone has, as you said, the spiritual retreat, we don't have always the chance to consciously go on retreat, for an extended time. But sometimes astrologically, you will see that within the life plan of that person, there is a time that actually forces you to retreat. So that's how the divine helps us, even though sometimes people will experience the beginning, if they don't understand that kind of cyclicality within their lives, they experience this as a very challenging time. And some people, they might almost lose their faith in life, but it's the divine calling you within. So for many people, it's a general retreat could be the Saturn return, age 27 to 30. So that is for most people, not for most, for many people, a time where the divine actually pushes you to retreat. So you can sense this, that now you have to go within yourself and have to think about life. What is life, And then you have smaller cycles. But if people knew that, and I think reading your book helps people to understand that this is a natural cycle, that's what naturally actually occurs and can occur, and you can have awareness about the cycle. And then if you know your astrological cycles, you understand what's the cycle right now, so you don't feel pressure to put yourself out if your natural cycle would indicate that now it's the time to draw within, for example. So I love that awareness of cycles, that people understand more that actually life is cyclical. It's not linear. It's not we are here and now. At some point we will be at that point. It's the cycle, and sometimes we have to remind ourselves that the quality of time is a given. So we can, of course, have focus on a specific thing, but we cannot influence the quality of time. It's a given. But if we understand what's the time right now, we can use it and benefit from it. So that is nice to see that even you say you don't have so much understanding about astrology, but in your book you can see it all over the book. There's that understanding that someone who walks the spiritual path actually is bestowed with, even without having the astrological symbolism or language.
Yeah, it's a nice verification in both directions, really. So, as you're speaking, I wish I did know a bit more about astrology, because I could have made quite a lot of interesting kind of links throughout the book to help people there. But at the same time, not having them in there and then finding out how they do meet the kind of the way these things and the way you approach things is very validating in both directions, because as you say, we all start to have an intuitive sense of these things as you delve more down these paths, and you start to become more attuned to how these rhythms and cycles are working in your own life. So no, that's very encouraging, which is good to know. And I've been very interested, actually. It just brings up quite an aside, but when I did the kind of explorations with planetary conjurations, and it was something that was quite new to me, but it was something that really started to get me in touch, at least with the kind of planetary forces. That's as far as I took my astrological explorations.
I love that, I read your write-ups on your blog. It's beautiful.
Thank you. But it was just made me realize how important those practices were to the Hermetic tradition and to the Rosicrucian tradition. And there's this real thread of what I would call astrotheurgy, that you're using the kind of planetary spheres as a process of self-initiation, attunement into relationship with the macrocosmic universe. And by doing that, you're kind of entering into that very communicative experience with the chain of being that runs from the microcosm to the macrocosm to the divine and everything in between. And it really made me realize that there is, even within an esoteric tradition, there's esotericism, right? So there's this thread of astrotheurgy, which I think is underappreciated, which I think these days is starting to become more and more appreciated as kind of planetary magic, and things like that are certainly widely discussed. But I was surprised to kind of find it so often within a lot of the Rosicrucian texts and people and orders. And it's one of those things, once you kind of get an ear for it, and once you have a bit of an understanding of it, you start to spot where it is. And it made me realize there's a very, very strong thread of astrological theurgy within the Rosicrucian tradition, emerging as it does out of Hermeticism. So yes, it's been very fruitful, even with a lack of understanding perhaps of why it might be so fruitful, but just to engage with these things in a very devotional, ceremonial way was very meaningful in my own path, and was used as a form of that spiritual retreat. It was used, it was an extended thing that kind of came in and out of my life over the course of 18 months, mostly because of the different kind of election periods that are required and things like that. But it was something that really took me out of kind of everything else I was doing or thinking about, and off up into the mountain and the woods to do these things. And it really just kind of got me in touch with some of these elements in a way that, quite literally elements, in a way that I hadn't quite appreciated before. So yes, although I do still have a lot of ignorance, I've got a much, much deeper appreciation for where a lot of these kind of astrological frameworks are talking about, and their importance. And the other thing I've kind of picked up more recently as well is just an appreciation for astronomy, and just an appreciation again, there's a connection with the scientific element of all of this. There is that connection there, and that wonder, that astronomical wonder that can occur, that we've lost sight of sometimes, and sometimes quite literally, because in the big cities you can't even see them anymore. Exactly. You're lucky to see the planets, let alone everything else. So it's all of these things are, and I know sometimes that can come across as a bit naive, but you know what, it is, as you said, in that contrast, having grown up in big cities my whole life, and then suddenly getting into a place where you can see the stars, and you can watch the planets move, and you can watch these things through telescopes that were being used in the 16th and 17th century. Same things today as they had back then. It's the same planets, believe it or not, that they were looking at, that we were looking at today. And all of these kind of things are just these wonderful little moments that, when you start to explore these things in a very practical way, it starts to connect on not just a kind of educational knowledge basis, but on a very emotional basis, and on a very deeply spiritual basis as well, once you start entering into that those communicative spaces. So yes, it's a very holistic vision that emerges, and we each feed different parts of it as we might need to, that are lacking in our own lives. That astrological component was certainly something that was lacking in mine, and when I started feeding it, suddenly, a lot of depth emerged out of working with the planetary spheres that I was never aware of was even there. And that will apply, to you in different areas as it did to me in that area. So it's just about figuring out where we need to kind of uplift some of that in our own path.
It was so genuine, and that's the beauty of it. If you are ready to walk the path, and if you have genuine motivation, and if you're open to receive, the divine will speak to you. So the planets, they are symbolism. It's a language. They talk to you, but you have to be open to receive a message. And it doesn't mean that you need to study years before you can actually do a conjuration. You can, if you have a sincere heart, if your motivation is pure, the planets will speak to you. And that's so beautiful to see in your write-ups what you have found out. You can study astrology for several years, but it's only the book knowledge. It's what other people have experienced and what they have transmitted to you. It's not your own personal experience. It goes to a very different level once you cherish that relationship with the planetary intelligences. If you are open to, if you open your mind to receive their message, it's not only a symbol. A planet,
Exactly.
it is a symbol, but it is much, much more.
It's a living symbol. Exactly.
It is actually, and it's very much what I have experienced is that throughout my spiritual life, I have come across tools that I would never have used back in the day. For example, astrology. I always thought that that's not anything I should, I was not even interested in, but at one point it just came to me, and I always heard that the divine says to me that that's also me. And if I read books from other religious traditions, I hear that voice. That's also me. So there are different parts, different tools we can use to understand what the divine actually is. But it's always in connection to where we are right now. What is our understanding? What can we take in? What can we grasp? So the divine is never giving us anything that's too high for us to understand or too low or something. It's always uniquely fitting our current situation. So you can start with very little knowledge, but if you're interested in astrology, so read something and the divine will show itself to you. So it was interesting to see your findings, and I love that your experience with Saturn. Saturn. There's so much
the joyful, laughing Saturn.
Absolutely, there's so much of the gloomy side of Saturn, and Saturn is that, of course, but Saturn is also everything else. So it's a very dualistic planet, and I have personal experiences with Saturn, and my understanding that a part of it is really reflected in what you experienced with Saturn. So.
Yeah, I found a lot of interesting things in the moments where you don't get the results you expect, right? So whenever you're entering, particularly in a ceremonial sense, whenever you're entering into those kind of imaginative, visionary spaces, and you're trying to connect your consciousness with higher celestial intelligences or visionary kind of processes, it's a real subtle landscape of different stuff that's going to come through. Some of it's from your very rational mind. Some of it's from where you want the answers you want to get. But it was always those things where if I would go into something with a certain expectation of what results were going to come out, or what the personality of this planet was going to feel like, or whatever, whenever it was kind of incongruous with that, is when it would seem to be the most interesting, because then you're entering, it's almost like, oh, we're in an area now that I didn't create, kind of coming into it. So now I'm exploring something, and I've been brought here, and that's where it feels communicative, because you're exploring something that you haven't formed going into it. And then there are those moments I was very grateful that there was a group of about half a dozen of us that met online that were going through these things together, and we were guided by some very kind of adept astrological people who were able to find the elections and things like that. But we kind of went into the Saturn conjuration with all this discussion about what were called parachute protocols and what happens if it goes wrong and these malefic forces and everything else. And then literally everyone came back and we all went off and did this individually at the same time because it was a chosen election. And we all came back and said, actually, this was a really kind of pleasant, joyful experience. And there was something very validating in the fact that we had all gone into it expecting one thing and gotten the exact opposite. And we didn't know we'd gotten the opposite until we came back and shared it with one another. And there was, so that shows that there was something here that wasn't just inside ourselves as we went out there. And I found stuff like that very encouraging. And that's also why sometimes when you're doing these kinds of things with other people, as long as, I think what was very beneficial was we were all kind of approaching it from slightly different traditions or practices or whatever. We weren't all kind of exactly monolithic in our understanding. But we were able to share our findings. And then when you're sharing your findings and there's a verification in that, and there's a kind of actually there's something here because there's these similar things are coming through and these similar experiences are coming through and we didn't expect any of it. So it's, that was really cool actually. And it just kind of goes to show that it takes a certain level of commitment and it does take a certain level of discipline and you got to go out and it's hard to do this stuff sometimes. But there's a lot of richness there and it doesn't take too much to get to it. You don't have to be studying astrology for 20 years before you can start doing these things. You don't have to have a very perfect diet for 10 years and yes, if you do all of these things and these huge devotional practices or your Abramelin workings over 18 months and these kinds of things, that I'm sure will lead people to heights that I can only, imagine at this point in time. But there's a lot to be gained from the initial stages of these journeys and explorations, which was very encouraging, very energizing, and just makes you realize that kind of the calling you've been hearing, for many of us since we're very, very young, is taking you somewhere meaningful. And learning how to hear that calling is, I think, the most important thing we can do on any of our spiritual paths, because it will take you to where you need to go.
Absolutely.
And it took me there, and there were things there that kind of speed boosted my progress in a way, and that stuff isn't always lasting, and follow up that very intensive 18 months with 6 months of finding it very difficult to even do my daily prayers and things like that. And it's like, it can, it's again, these cycles, I guess. But once you learn to hear that calling, it's going to take you some really important places. So.
It's a beautiful testimony about that the divine is ready to talk. So yes, it's about us to open ourselves up. So it's not about going somewhere, listening what other people say about the divine. It's about you practically living your life, your daily life with the divine and being open to what you receive. And of course, we all have our own birth charts that influence us. So we have naturally connections to the planets in a certain way. We receive their messages differently, and they also they are embodied within us differently. But then it's nice to hear that you can have this kind of universal message from the divine when you do these conjurations within a group, and the group comes afterwards together and share their experience. It's nice to see that actually that Saturn was delivering a message that is the same for everybody. So it really feels that this is something that needs to get out. It's not something personal only. It's something that is shared, and that is something well, you could say Saturn makes sure that the message gets out there through different people coming together. It's not anything personal only. Well, it's not personally only. It's also a global message in a way.
Exactly. Yeah. No, exactly. And to just one other example from from those series of conjuration. I would say on my website, futureconscience.com, I've put up the diaries of all of these. So if anybody listening wants to read, they're not in the book itself. It's stuff that's on the website. So please do. And I gave a talk recently for SRIA London, which you can find online, about it all as well. But one of the other ones that really stands out to me was Mars, and going into the conjuration of Mars and being there. It's like, okay, what do I kind of want to get out of this? What do I want to ask for help with? And it's about, overcoming my frustrations and things like that in life, and just being a bit more disciplined and able to face those things in a more kind of calm and stoic manner. And I go into this conjuration with Mars, and it's an hour-long hike. And the election meant it was in the dark, because I slightly mistimed the fact that it would be, the sun wouldn't be up. So I'm hiking up, it's raining, it's windy, it's horrible. I couldn't actually get to the place I wanted to because the whole thing was covered in mist. And I just kind of took that, executive decision not to endanger my own life to go do some magic up in the woods. And then going through all of that process and that feeling of like, well, I'm putting in all this determined effort. This is going to be worth it. This is going to have a fantastic result. And nothing showed up. The conjuration was a failure. From that sense, there was no communication that occurred. It didn't happen. But then you kind of pack it all up and you come back down and you realize, well, actually, there was that kind of, I was searching for the result. That was that kind of, and I was put through such a challenging process to get there. And I should be, that kind of sense of frustration that there's no result at the end of that is in some ways a lesson to be learned, right? So it was just really funny. Again, it's like, well, I didn't quite get what I was expecting. And so, all these things it was just really eye-opening. And again, a lot of it for me was because it was in the natural world and it had that connection to the natural world. And so certain of the kind of elemental aspects could come out a bit more, that literal aspects of having the sun rising on certain things, and, having very literal experiences of the soul force and things like that just become very literal in a way that they always have been throughout time. And I think we sometimes lose a sense of the literal importance of something like the sun. We just become so blind to it, ironically enough, that we forget its influence. But then trying to open up into a experience of where you relate to it just becomes so beneficial.
Going back to reading nature, being one with nature, understanding nature, and your Mars experience is very much about Mars. Mars's core essence is actually separation, in a way. So you're not getting the connection actually there, and being frustrated actually also very much related to Mars.
Yes, exactly.
During the whole journey to that place, you figured you would have the conjuration. So Mars was present throughout the whole...
Yes, exactly. That's what people have said. It's like, the Mars did show up. You might not have thought that at the time. But, yes, it's a wonderful thing. We've talking about a lot of different things today, obviously, but it's just these kind of open discussions, I think, are really, really important. And that's why I encourage everybody, connect on Twitter, let's get these conversations going. That's how you and I met, on Twitter, and all these things emerge, and we can learn from one another. And I just find that part of the really hopeful element, all of this and all of our newly kind of always online kind of lives, is it enables us to start having very open conversations about things that can be quite personal and difficult to communicate. But when you meet people who are going through similar things, and there's millions of us around the world, then it becomes a very encouraging and uplifting thing to share. So it's really great. And thank you for the platform you're providing to come discuss it, and the texts you're writing, which helped me kind of make sense of some of these conjurations as I was doing them, and realizing that there were certain symbols I were getting that were relating to certain things, even though I hadn't seen it at the time. This is what part of that social engagement part of the cycle is all about as well. So.
Yeah, it's uplifting, it's helping each other. So it's nice to see that we can connect and that we can spread hope throughout the real connection, the unique, the sincere connection. We can achieve that. And sometimes people might be afraid these days about the future, what's to come. But I like that although you are concerned about what could be the downside of the future, you also always come back to the possibilities. You come back to that we actively can take part in shaping the future, that we just need to think about what do we want from the future, what are the possibilities, and how do we navigate. That's important. I think we really need to sit down with our minds and our imagination and our heart about what do we want to become in the future. And that's what your tradition, you are part of the Rosicrucian tradition, that's part of that core essence. How do we take part in shaping the future, and what is our goal? And it's a bit different than back in the 17th century. So times have changed, but the essence is still the same, and you can feel this, you can see this. And I hope that people will find connection, real true connection with people, like-minded people, and that we can lift up the collective. There is hope.
There is hope. There's always hope.
So, you already mentioned your website, futureconscience.com.
Yes, that's kind of, I've been writing that since 2009, really. It was really focused a lot on the ethics of technology and futurism and other things. But as I became more and more comfortable with sharing the more esoteric side of things, it becomes pretty deeply kind of mystical over time, which I think was quite shocking to some of the people who were following it for a more technological perspective. But at the same time, it was just, I saw a certain kind of a balance in that, well, and again, it goes back to that question, what do we want to be? And this is both a spiritual question and a scientific question and emotional and a moral question. There's all these, it's the same question, but we have to ask it over all aspects of our lives and the human endeavor. So yeah, so futureconscience.com for all the writings, and FutureCon on Twitter. If anybody wants to reach out, please do. Always happy to have conversations. So.
Yeah. And where can people get your book?
So 21st Century Rosicrucianism, it was published by Lewis Masonic. So that is in the UK and Europe, the best place to get it. If you're in North America, McCoy Publishing are the distributors there, so you don't have to pay for international shipping. There is an ebook version available on the Lewis Masonic website, and heavens forbid, there is an audiobook version coming, which, as I found out having recorded the first chapter, is quite the undertaking, but it will get there. And so there is an audiobook version coming, read by myself, for those who prefer to kind of listen to this material. But I would encourage everybody to engage with it, and then please reach out, because ultimately that's what it's all about. So.
Thank you, Robert.
Oh, thank you very much. Absolutely.
Very glad to have had you today, and this was a very lovely talk with you. And
no, thank you. And hopefully the first of many. We'll come back sometime and we can discuss what's happened a few years down the track and whether we think things are progressing in the right directions.
Absolutely. There's hope.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.